that the United States and China are already in the early stages of Cold War II.
This is a Cold War that is ideological in nature. Xi Jinping makes it very clear that he's against democracy, he's against the rule of law, he's against individual freedom. It's also technological, like the first Cold War. It's geopolitical. It's about particular regions, flashpoints, such as Taiwan. So as in Cold War I, the Middle East is a really important place. And the most important lesson of Cold War I was you must have credible deterrence.
The war in Ukraine is the first hot war of Cold War II. But what we're talking about with respect to Taiwan is the equivalent of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and we'll call it the Taiwan Semiconductor Crisis, but it is highly likely to happen this decade. So in Cold War II, there's a very important difference. Before we just assume, oh, Cold War II will be a bit like Cold War I in terms of duration, I don't think that's guaranteed. Nor is it guaranteed that we win, because of course we won Cold War I. We shouldn't assume that we'll win Cold War II.
The US is already in Cold War 2.0 with China. That's according to esteemed historian and author Niall Ferguson, who has been sounding the alarm since 2018 when he started formulating his Cold War II thesis, partly after conversations with Henry Kissinger.
Henry Kissinger died last year, shortly after celebrating his 100th birthday. It seems to me that if you want to understand the geopolitical situation we find ourselves in, he was a reliable guide. No one understood the Cold War better than Henry Kissinger. I asked him just over 4 years ago at a conference in Beijing, if we were in a new Cold War, if China had taken the place of the Soviet Union, and he replied memorably, "We are in the foothills of a Cold War." A year later, he upgraded that to the mountain passes of a Cold War. And the year before he turned 100, when I asked him about it again, he said, the second Cold War will be even more dangerous than the first, because, of course, we now have artificial intelligence as well as nuclear weapons.
Ferguson wrote an opinion article for the New York Times in 2019 when he believes Cold War 2.0 really started after a trade war metastasized into a cluster of other conflicts.
The United States and China are already in the early stages of Cold War II because it's not just about trade. It's about technology, it's also got a geopolitical dimension, and you could argue that if there is a lesson of history, it is that when there is an incumbent power being challenged by a rising power, more often than not, conflict results. That's an argument my old friend Graham Allison made in his book Destined for War. I think the good news is that I don't think they're destined for a hot war over the South China Sea or anywhere else, but I do think they're in a Cold War. And I think that's why the Cold War analogy is reasonably good, because the competition that we see in the world today is a competition that's partly ideological. Let's look at the case of Hong Kong, where it's very clear that there is a tension between the rule of law tradition in the former British colony and the one-party state that claims to run Hong Kong, albeit indirectly. There's also an economic challenge. China is, at least by one measure, a larger economy than that of the United States today. And then you have the technology cyberspace race. In some ways, China's pulled ahead, at least in, say, payments technology. And there is an extremely interesting race going on in the realm of quantum computing, to take just one example. So this all reminds me of early Cold War, when the Soviet Union appeared to be catching up with the United States. It didn't catch up economically, but it certainly did catch up in terms of nuclear weapons and the space race.
He also pointed out that 2019 was when hostility towards China snapped into conventional wisdom in the U.S., with both Republicans and Democrats calling for a tougher line towards Beijing. Ferguson also pointed to a 2019 Pew Research survey that showed that the number of Americans viewing China unfavorably jumped to 60% unfavorable from 47% unfavorable just the year before. As I detailed in my video last week, in 2024, that figure has grown to an all-time high of 81% unfavorable.
Now it's conventional wisdom. Now it's a bipartisan issue that the United States needs to wake up to the Chinese challenge. The problem for Trump is that having started this Cold War with a trade war, he's no longer in a position to simply turn it off when it suits him, because the thing has escalated into other domains, and particularly into the domain of technology, and I think he has much less control over that.
Since 2019, Ferguson has refined and deepened his argument that Cold War 2.0 has already started by drawing a number of parallels between the first Cold War with the Soviet Union and Cold War II with China, and putting developments in Ukraine, Israel, Iran, and Taiwan in context.
And as in Cold War I, there are certain, I think, clear implications of that. Because this is a Cold War that is ideological in nature. Xi Jinping makes it very clear that he's against democracy, he's against the rule of law, he's against individual freedom. It's also technological, like the first Cold War. It's a race not just for nuclear weapons, though it is that, but it's also a race in artificial intelligence and quantum computing. It's geopolitical. It's about particular regions, flashpoints such as Taiwan. And it's economic, because China is a much larger economy than the Soviet Union ever was. So this is Cold War II. Now, Cold Wars are not entirely cold. One characteristic feature of the first Cold War was that there were hot wars here and there. The first hot war was really in Korea. I think Ukraine is really the Korea of our times. It's a war that broke out to the great surprise of many people in the West. It didn't surprise me, because I think President Putin made his intentions pretty clear. But it was a revelation, and it made many people realize that the stakes are higher than they thought, and that the other side is prepared to fight dirtier than they expected. President Putin would not have invaded Ukraine without a green light from Xi Jinping. He would not be able to sustain his war effort without very large-scale exports from China to Russia of dual-use technologies, things that may be civilian in one place but can equally well be used in the battlefields of Ukraine. So that's point one. As in Cold War I, the Middle East is a really important place, because despite the best intentions of the Greens, we are still a hydrocarbon-fueled world. And that is still the place where the most crude oil is in the ground. And that means that, as in Cold War I, so in Cold War II, the Middle East is of huge strategic importance. And any collision there, any eruption there, has geopolitical ramifications. This is not just Iran backing its proxies to carry out an attack on Israel. Russia plays a part in this story too, because Russia has air defense systems in Syria that can track every Israeli warplane the minute it takes off. So geopolitically, we've got to adjust to the fact that we're back in that world that you and I grew up in. And we thought it had gone away in 1989 or maybe in 91 when the Soviet Union fell apart. And we thought we were going to have this endless peace dividend, and everything was going to be awesome. There would be only one superpower. It would be the United States, and we would live happily ever after, and globalization would make us all rich, and it would be win-win with the Chinese. We believed that from the 1990s through the first part of this new century, and the scales only fell from our eyes quite recently. And that, I think, is where we are. These three theatres of conflict, number one, Ukraine and Eastern Europe, number two, on Israel, number three, potentially the next shoe to drop, Taiwan, are not separate. They're part of a global struggle for power. And that struggle is fundamentally between the free world, as was true in the first Cold War, and an unfree world with a bunch of ideologies, of which communism, Marxism, Leninism is still one, that are deeply hostile to the notion of individual liberty. I think it's just hard for us to accept that we're back there and that the interwar period is over. But that's the reality.
So the Ukraine is critically important because if we stop supporting it and it fails and the Russians succeed, they've got their first major stroke against us. So it's really a conflict for the whole of the free world, and we need to keep that in mind. Would that be a fair assessment?
Well, I think it's all too likely that Ukraine will lose on our present trajectory, because we have given the Ukrainians up until this point enough weaponry not to lose, but not enough to win. If our interest wanes, and it is clearly waning amongst Republican voters and Republican politicians in the United States, if support wanes, and it could be cut off if Donald Trump is re-elected president in November of 2024, then I don't see how Ukraine can win. In fact, it seems to me that it's quite likely that Ukraine loses. We have reached a very critical point in that conflict. A stalemate has been arrived at. The Ukrainians themselves acknowledge this. Their offensive this summer achieved far less than they had hoped. In terms of raw resources, it's David v. Goliath. But at this point, Goliath looks more and more the likely favorite. If Russia wins this war, or if it, to put it very, very modestly, if it is able to retain control of those parts of Ukraine that it currently does control, that land bridge, so-called, that extends right down to Crimea, which it annexed in 2014, that will be the first big defeat of Cold War II for the West, because we were all in. We were all in our support for Zelensky. How many speeches did Western leaders make in support of Ukraine? How many promises did they make? How many pledges were there to be there for as long as it took? If we lose, our credibility is shot. And then turn to the Middle East. What if there is an all-out, multi-front assault on Israel? The Israeli Defense Forces are stretched to breaking point, and the United States does not intervene, simply carries on, lamely calling for some kind of diplomatic resolution. What if those aircraft carrier strike groups just sit there and do nothing to impact Iran, the sponsor of this multi-front attack? Then what? You'll have lost Ukraine as an independent state, potentially. Then the fate of Israel hangs in the balance. It would be surprising, wouldn't it, if Xi Jinping didn't take the opportunity to add Taiwan to the strategic mix? Because how exactly would the United States respond if Taiwan were blockaded by China tomorrow? I don't like to think how the conversation in the Situation Room would go, as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs explained that it would be rather difficult to send another major naval expedition across the Pacific to run that blockade, particularly because if that were to trigger hostilities between the US and China, a much larger war would ensue than anything we've seen so far. So this is a very dangerous moment in world history. And I think we've stumbled into it, partly by forgetting the lessons of Cold War I. And the most important lesson of Cold War I was you must have credible deterrence. You must credibly deter the Russians, or Soviets as they were then, from sending their forces into Western Europe, from intervening, which they nearly did in 1973 in the Middle East. We've lost that credible deterrence. We failed to deter President Putin from invading Ukraine. We are failing to deter Iran now from attacking Israel through its proxies. And I really worry, John, that we're going to fail to deter China from making a move against Taiwan. And in that scenario, the West will find itself in a worse situation than it was at any time in the First Cold War.
Cold War I was really a 4-decade affair. It ended actually rather sooner than most experts anticipated. But there's no guarantee that Cold War II will last as long, because China is a far more formidable adversary than the Soviet Union was. Economically, it has all but caught up. By one measure, gross domestic product based on purchasing power parity, China overtook the United States in 2014. The Soviets never got close. By that measure, their peak was 44% the size of the United States. So purely from an economic vantage point, Cold War II is worse. From a technological vantage point, it's also worse because we have the nuclear weapons of Cold War I. Of course, we have superior weapons to the weapons they had at the beginning of Cold War I, but we also have a lot of things that they didn't have in Cold War I, from artificial intelligence to maybe quantum computing. And so Cold War II is taking place with a great deal more technology, a great deal more firepower than Cold War I. Let's stare reality in the face. In Cold War I, it was really quite hard for the Soviets to find out things about the United States because the number of Soviet citizens in the United States was pretty small throughout, and we knew who they were and where they were, and there was some penetration of American institutions, but by comparison with Cold War II, it was nothing. In Cold War II, you have massive social and economic interpenetration. There are all kinds of ways in which the Chinese can find out things about our relatively open access society and economy, and not just by being here, though they certainly are here in much larger numbers than the Soviets were, but also electronically. So I do think before we just assume, oh, Cold War II will be a bit like Cold War I in terms of duration, I don't think that's guaranteed. Nor is it guaranteed that we win, because of course we won Cold War I. We shouldn't assume that we'll win Cold War II.
Taiwan, just off the coast of China, an island about the size of Maryland, half the size of Scotland, population 23 million, a genuine functioning democracy with a thriving free market economy. Good. Here's the quotation. You, in your regular column for Bloomberg News, this is a couple of years ago, losing or not even fighting for Taiwan would be seen all over Asia as the end of American predominance in the region. It would surely cause a run on the dollar and U.S. treasuries. It would be an American Suez. Suez, the 1957 British failure to keep the Egyptians from taking Suez, and that's the moment when everybody, including the British themselves, realized Britain is no longer a global power. Okay.
Correct.
And Americans, why should we have so much at stake? Why should we be risking an American Suez with an island on the other side of the world?
Well, it's a great question because going back to something you said a moment ago, we used to accept that Taiwan was part of China. And indeed, we still officially do have a one China policy. So one of the oddities about Taiwan is that it's not really controversial that China claims it. And we do not recognize it as an independent state. In fact, you'll get told off even for referring to it as a country in some circles. So what's changed? Because for the better part of half a century, really since Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon figured out the Shanghai Communique with Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai, we have gone along with the fiction that Taiwan is part of China. We've had something called strategic ambiguity since the late 1970s, and that ambiguity was that people in Congress who weren't so sure about what Kissinger and Nixon had done said, well, we have to have some commitment to Taiwan. And the commitment was an act of Congress that said, if China tried to change the status quo by force, we essentially reserved the right to take military action. But this is the ambiguity of our policy for 50 years. We kind of accept the Chinese claim that Taiwan's part of China, but we also say that if they try to assert that claim by force, we may do something about it. What's changed in the last few years is that Cold War II has begun, even if Americans don't call it by that name. Increasingly, since around 2018, the United States, and this is true of both Republicans and Democrats, has taken a tougher stance on China generally and on Taiwan specifically. President Biden, on at least 3, maybe 4 occasions, has seemed to repudiate strategic ambiguity. A number of leading policy intellectuals, Richard Haas, former Grand Panjandrum of the Council on Foreign Relations, said in 2020, why do we carry on with this strategic ambiguity nonsense? Let's be unambiguous in our commitment to Taiwan. Nancy Pelosi, the former Speaker of the House, paid a visit to the island in which she acted to all intents and purposes as if Taiwan was an independent state she was visiting. So I think there's been a significant shift in our general attitude towards China and our specific attitude towards Taiwan. And the Chinese, in turn, have been upping the ante. And you gave one example there, the recent blockade exercise at the time of Speaker McCarthy's meeting with the Taiwanese president. But they did something very similar when Nancy Pelosi was in Taiwan. So we are moving quite fast in the direction of a showdown over Taiwan after more or less half a century of strategic ambiguity. It's not the same as Hong Kong. Let's just be clear.
Correct the whole analogy.
Well, the status is completely different. As a former British colony, Hong Kong was not a democracy, never had democracy. And what's happened is that Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, has simply expedited the takeover of Hong Kong, which was supposed to happen somewhat later this century. There's no act of Congress that obliges the US government to give a hoot about that. And that's why it was always pretty much a very faint reflex action when Americans complained about what was happening in Hong Kong. Britain should have been complaining a lot louder because it was actually an agreement with Britain that the Chinese were violating. Taiwan's different. I mean, Taiwan has been a successful, vibrant democracy since the end of the military dictatorship there. It's one of the most successful economies in the world. Part of its success is due to its being now the leading center for the production of the most sophisticated semiconductors. TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor company set up by Morris Chang there, has become the world leader. And so economically, control of Taiwan matters a lot, much more than the control of Hong Kong in terms of the global economy. Mm-hmm. Now, the critical point to notice here is that Taiwan's not Israel, nor is it Ukraine, because the Taiwanese population over the years has moved steadily away from the mainland. And so I think a big problem from the vantage point of Beijing is that Taiwan is drifting away in ways that nobody in the 1970s foresaw. I think many people in the 70s thought it would only be a matter of time before Taiwan was folded in to the embrace of the mainland. That is not happening. And the Chinese haven't been able to devise any political way of stopping this divergence from happening. And I'll say one final thing that is very important to understand. Xi Jinping has broken with convention by extending his time as president, as leader of the CCP and of the Chinese state. Why? His main argument for having that extension of term was Taiwan. Xi Jinping has said to those close to him, and it's pretty clear from public statements too, that he regards bringing Taiwan under the control of the CCP as the keystone, capstone, the crowning achievement of his career, the reason that he's staying in power for longer than his predecessors. So it's a very high stakes issue for him, and we, of course, in turn have made it a high stakes issue for us. The more unambiguous we are about our commitment to Taiwan, the more of a problem that is for Xi Jinping. Well, I think Cold War II is happening faster than Cold War I. Let me try and illustrate the point. When George Orwell first used the term Cold War in 1945, almost nobody got the point. Orwell's extraordinary essay about the future in which there would be nuclear superpowers nailed it. He defined Cold War as a peace that is no peace and predicted that nuclear-armed superpowers, he said there would be three: the United States, the Soviet Union, and China. And he said, in this world, this of course is an anticipation of his great novel 1984, there would be this permanently armed peace that is no peace. It took years for Americans to get the point. When Winston Churchill gave the famous Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, Missouri, the New York Times was highly critical of the speech and accused him of being a warmonger. Most Americans didn't get it until North Korea invaded South Korea in 1950. And that's the analogy I'd like to suggest to you with Ukraine. The war in Ukraine is the first hot war of Cold War II. And just as the Korean War was the first hot war of Cold War I, it's the moment of revelation in which people in the United States begin to see that this is serious. Remember, Putin would not have invaded Ukraine without a green light from Xi Jinping. He would not still be able to prosecute his war without the substantial economic support he gets from trade with China. So I think we should imagine the Korean War, Ukraine War analogy. That gets us to the 1950s. That's the sort of early 50s. And the war is going to play out pretty much like the Korean War did. A year of really serious fighting and back and forth, and then attrition, and it all gets bogged down and stalemate. And then eventually you start some kind of armistice process. You never actually get to peace. I could see all of that playing out. But what we're talking about with respect to Taiwan is the equivalent of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which happened, as you know, Peter, in 1962. Yes. I think we could get to 1962 a lot faster than they did in Cold War I, and we'll call it the Taiwan Semiconductor Crisis. And here's the interesting thing about this crisis. I do not know if it happens next year, if it happens in 2025, if it doesn't happen until 2028, but it is highly likely to happen this decade. The variables that are crucial here are the Chinese are not ready militarily to achieve a successful amphibious invasion. They would be taking immense risk if they did that now, and I don't think they will. I think they're in a position to blockade the island, but I'm not sure they're ready for the consequences if we decide to run that blockade and take them on. So I think they're not quite ready for prime time, but they cannot wait indefinitely. Why? Because to go back to our earlier discussion, every passing year gives the United States time to get Taiwan ready to defend itself. It's not now. But we know that this is the issue, and we have got a coherent strategy which we could execute to make Taiwan much harder to invade than it currently is. And that's why I think the time frame is measurable in single-digit years. It's not something that Xi Jinping can say, oh, I'll take care of it in 2030. That is just not an option for him. I mean, this is not a bug, it's a feature of Cold War that the United States is overwhelmingly the dominant supplier of security. And it's only in a country like Israel that discovered the hard way that it couldn't rely entirely on the United States in 1973, when the United States was, well, we'll kind of help you, yeah, but first you have to negotiate. I think for the Israelis, 73 was the moment of truth when they realized that the US might be an important part of their future security, but they'd have to be able to fend for themselves because Uncle Sam is not entirely reliable. Ukraine isn't that different. I mean, Ukraine was not ready for prime time. So we don't know how Taiwan would respond to a blockade by China. We don't know how the Taiwanese would respond to an attempted amphibious invasion. Most people before February 22nd last year would have predicted that Ukraine would fold quite quickly. So I don't think one should assume that Taiwan is somehow untypical. It's actually behaving quite rationally as a country that the US has made a security commitment to. Well, the thing about Cold Wars is that you don't get to choose. You have, in fact, what I call the three body of water problem, namely that you have to be ready to go to war, or at least to deter your foes. In Europe, the North Atlantic, you have to be able to deter them also in the Pacific and East Asia, and let's not forget the Persian Gulf. And the US doesn't have the option to say, oh, I'm just going to pivot to Asia. Can you guys all just behave yourselves in Europe and the Middle East? Any more than it did in Cold War I. The problem about Cold War is it's global. China can now play globally. It is now a player in the Middle East. So the US doesn't have the luxury of being able to choose. It has to be ready to contain Chinese expansion in all three at once. That's my answer to this question. It's not a choice. The problem about a war over Taiwan, Jim Stavridis makes this point very well in a book he wrote on the subject, is that it could get very big very fast. A limited war over Taiwan is a little hard to imagine, just as a limited war over Cuba was very hard to imagine. I want to try and suggest to you a very important part of my analogy. Remember, we said Cold War I and Cold War II are not exactly the same any more than World War I and World War II were exactly the same, but you didn't really argue about there being world wars. Right. So in Cold War II, there's a very important difference between the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Taiwan Semiconductor Crisis. And that is that in Cold War II, we are the Soviet Union. Because in Cold War II, it's the Communist Power that gets to impose the blockade, whereas it was John F. Kennedy who blockaded Cuba. We called it a quarantine, but it was essentially a blockade. And it was the Soviets, it was Khrushchev who had to send a naval force to Cuba. That was the most risky moment in the whole of Cold War I. Only this time around, the boot is on the other foot. It's China that has the option to blockade Taiwan. We would then have to send a naval force to run that blockade. We would be in the Khrushchev situation. And that's what makes me the most nervous about this. I mean, generally speaking, rerunning the Cuban Missile Crisis is a bad idea. It was the most dangerous moment, the nearest we came to World War III in the whole of the Cold War. And in many ways, it was just luck, sheer luck, that it didn't become World War III. Why would you want to rerun that game and expect the outcome always to be good? So we shouldn't be running the Cuban Missile Crisis again, but we certainly shouldn't be rerunning it when we get to play the Soviet Union. Because remember what happened. In the end, Khrushchev had to back down. He took a deal with the Kennedy brothers, but it wasn't public, and so it looked like he'd been humiliated, and it was pretty much curtains for his career at that point. But it was also a major setback for the Soviets. We don't want to put ourselves in that position. So my view is we have to follow through with the commitment we made to Ukraine. We are now in a position where we cannot afford for Ukraine to lose. Problem is, China can't afford for Russia to lose. That's why this war is going to keep going, because both superpowers are essentially now backing one of the dogs in the fight. While that carries on, we have got to come up with a good answer to the question, how do we deter China from invading or blockading Taiwan? Because right now, what we've got is some good rhetoric and some very poor strategic options. The war games don't always turn out very well. There was a recent one which strongly suggested it would go very badly for the United States. I think we've got a very short period of time to come up with a good answer to that question. If we don't, then we run the risk of having our bluff called. I mean, right now we're basically talking loudly and carrying a small stick when it comes to Taiwan, and everybody knows that that's the wrong way around. They're a lot more innovative than the Soviets were because they have a substantial part of their economy that is a market economy. There's a reason why Chinese internet companies are, after American internet companies, the world's biggest, and there are no European internet companies worth talking about. And that's because the market operated when it came to developing the internet, particularly commercializing it. If one looks at the research that goes on in fields like artificial intelligence or quantum computing, it's the US v China. There are no other players in this race. They won't even award a bronze medal. And that's one of the reasons that it's recognizably Cold War II, because there are two superpowers technologically. Now, I think the Chinese are still silver medalists. Look at vaccines. They utterly failed. Despite their boasts in 2020 that they would develop the vaccines against COVID, they didn't, and we did. And that's encouraging. And I basically agree with your view that our system is likely to win the innovation race. But I have a couple of caveats. Number one, we have to mean it. What made Cold War I go well for the United States was that we understood we were in a technological race with a communist superpower that was determined to steal our technology and ultimately to bury us. When I started talking about Cold War II back in 2018, at the time when Huawei was the talk of the town, I elicited initially skeptical reactions. I can remember Eric Schmidt's face when I first said this at a meeting in San Francisco. I said to him, look, the reason I'm saying this is we have to understand that we're in a Cold War or we will lose it. If we have open access research, if the AI labs at Google, or for that matter at Stanford, are freely accessible by CCP operatives, then we're done. So one reason for talking about this is to make Americans realize that we are in a race and we can't simply post it all online and not worry. We have to protect our intellectual property. They will steal it. They have been stealing it because, as you said, that's the communist way. Copy the technology and then paste it, whether it's electric cars or, for that matter, giant online markets. I mean, what is Alibaba if not an Amazon knockoff at some level? But there's a second caveat. About half the billion-dollar unicorn companies created in this country since the mid-1990s were founded by, that's right, immigrants. Elon Musk, not homegrown, and the list goes on. If we don't keep the channel open for legal immigration of very talented, ambitious people, we will not win the technological race. That's our superpower, importing talent and giving it capital. That's the real magic of the United States. I mean, you can talk about democratic capitalism and all of the rest of it. You know, the real secret sauce of the United States is magnet for talent. Here are the resources that you couldn't get, Elon, in South Africa or Canada. Only here is it possible for you to build those dreams. We need to get back to the system we had, and which really served us well from the 1980s, of being the country open to talent. If we don't do that, then I think China has a decent chance. If we can get the talent flowing back into the United States, they're done, because nobody wants to immigrate to China. You just ask people all over the world, where would you like to go? It's essentially the United States or the most developed European countries or the UK. Is the appeal of the Chinese model in sub-Saharan Africa, in Latin America, in the Middle East, in Central Asia, indeed all over the so-called developing or emerging world. If you are running a chaotic African country which is poor economically, the Chinese offer you a solution to the crowd control problem, which is better than anything yet available prior to this time. You have surveillance technology, you have the AI, you have the cameras, you can nail down your civilian population, and the Chinese have a second thing to offer you, and that is infrastructure. You don't have roads, we'll do roads. You don't have telecoms, we have Huawei. If you look at a map of the world, according to Huawei, you can see where the Chinese appeal is strongest. It's in the relatively poor parts of the world that need to have Huawei's hardware because it's cheaper than any other hardware, and they need the financing that Huawei can offer them. The reason I started talking about Cold War II was that I saw that map, the map of the world according to Huawei, back in 2017 or 18, at a time when the US was deciding to shut Huawei out, and some other countries were following our lead, like Australia. And I looked at the map of the world, and there were the countries that were saying no to Huawei. That was the US and its close allies. There were the countries that were saying yes to Huawei, and that was what you called the third world. And then there were the non-aligned countries were like, you know, can we maybe have a little bit of both? Right. That's a very Cold War map. As soon as you see it, you think, oh man, this looks really familiar.
It's trickier to know what it would mean. Suppose they did win. What would a Chinese victory look like? What's at risk?
Well, first of all, let's remember that there are kind of three paths to think about. There's the disastrous path, the World War III path, right, where we go head to head over Taiwan or somewhere else and things escalate, and before you know it, those nuclear weapons are flying. That is not to be dismissed out of hand. I think one of the big dangers about a US-China war is that there would be no stopping it from escalating. So that's a future we certainly want to avoid, just as we wanted to avoid it in Cold War I. Then there's a second plausible scenario in which there's a showdown and we fold. That's my American Suez. That's the moment when we suddenly discover, oh, the United States is not numero uno anymore. It can't actually uphold its dominance in the Indo-Pacific region. And I think that is also something that would be undesirable here, because there were significant prices to be paid for the end of empire. One of the most enjoyable features about being an American is that you are the issuer of the world's reserve currency and the currency that is favored in almost all international transactions, and you can sell your 10-year treasuries to the rest of the world, and the rest of the world will buy them because they foolishly think it's a risk-free asset. So if you lose geopolitics, as Britain did in the late 1950s, it's amazing how rapidly your currency can depreciate. I mean, it's not that long ago that it was $1.07 to the pound. That was during the Liz Truss fiasco. It was $4.86 when Britain's empire was up and running, and that's to be taken very seriously. The United States would find it expensive to be a second-tier power. The RMB is not a convertible currency. But as I just pointed out in a new piece for Bloomberg Opinion, it is a currency that is being used more and more in transactions by China's trading partners. We should not underestimate how quickly the structure of the international financial system would change if the US was no longer the credible #1 global superpower. But then there's a broader question, which I think is what you're really getting at, Peter. And what's the world like if China is number one? I think that's not a very agreeable world to live in, because China's attitude towards individual rights, human rights, is on display in, you don't need to go to another planet, you just need to go and see the way in which the Uyghurs are treated in Xinjiang, where there are labor camps, where perhaps 1 million people are under detention. There are re-education programs. There are policies with respect to fertility that could easily be characterized and have been characterized as genocidal. So let's not forget that at the heart of this system is the old totalitarian devil, the old dark force that we once understood so well in Cold War I, when we had to stare the Soviet system in the face and imagine what its extension would be like. I'm not sure the expansion of Chinese power would be significantly different wherever it encountered resistance. If China's in a position to export its model of social control and state surveillance to Africa, where almost all the population growth is going to be for the rest of this century, then a rising share of humanity finds itself under the great Beijing panopticon. So I think we need to regard the future, the world under Chinese dominance, with at least some of the froideur with which we used to regard a Soviet-dominated world. But can I come to my third scenario?
Of course.
The third scenario, which I think is the plausible one, is that we find ourselves trying to prevent the expansion of Chinese power in multiple theatres. Containment is not the word we necessarily use, because that was George Kennan's word, but we're already doing it. And it's funny, really, to be engaged in a Cold War without acknowledging that. But if you look at the Biden administration's national security strategy that just came out, it says we're not in a new Cold War, no new Cold War, but everything in it implies that we're in a Cold War. What is the goal that they're currently pursuing? To limit China's ability to catch up with us technologically by cutting it off, that's what the Commerce Department did last year, from the most sophisticated semiconductors and the people and technology you need to make them. So we've kind of put the sanctions on China ex ante rather than waiting for a showdown. That's a really important part of Cold War. The effort of the leading power to preserve its technological leadership by preventing the rising power from catching up. I think that's the plausible future that we have to fight in multiple geographies, but above all, we have to fight to maintain our technological leadership. That's the future I think we're in.
Why don't they call it a Cold War? I mean, I
know why.
I think of John Kennedy's inaugural address. We will bear any burden, oppose any foe, and his ratings.
But we're currently, remember, in that early phase of the Cold War when we don't want to face it, and we think that if we call it by its real name, we'll somehow make matters worse because we'll upset Xi Jinping. And I think that sense that it would be rather undiplomatic to call it a Cold War in public is very widespread. You talk to people in the State Department or in the European, particularly in the European foreign ministries, and that's what you'll hear. Oh, don't call it that, Neil. You'll really upset them. And that's classic early Cold War. Right. Remember how we used to worry about Uncle Joe in the period between 1945 and 1950? That sense that you got from the New York Times reaction to the Fulton,
yes,
Missouri
exactly.
speech. Say we're in that state of mind. So, because one of the lessons of Cold War I is our vulnerability is our capacity for internal division.
Yes.
Things went most wrong in the Cold War when the United States was most divided over Vietnam in that period from the sort of late 60s to the early 70s, when the country was really very, very deeply riven. That is not a problem they have in China. One reason that I'm talking about Cold War II is that I do think this country needs an external foe. It really helps. If we don't have one, we just fall apart. We just tear one another to pieces. And it's very interesting to see how in periods in the past 100 years when Americans haven't had a clear geopolitical project, haven't had a clear geopolitical rival, tends to be the period when the division gets nastiest. It was when we stopped believing in the Soviet threat and decided in the late 60s that we were really the problem. We were really the problem in Vietnam, that things became most toxic. So maybe this is just the immigrant's eye view, but I do think, my fellow Americans, you do play better when there is a clear external threat. So let's not underestimate how much that probably helps. Notice, bipartisanship is back. on one issue and one issue alone, and that's China. It's a quite extraordinary thing that when you meet with members of Mike Gallagher's new House committee on the Chinese Communist Party, the Democrats and Republicans agree on a surprisingly large number of things, not on everything, but there's a real bipartisan sense that China is the major strategic challenge. So if it's polarization you worry about, I have good news for you, because if you put against China in the title of your bill, it'll get through the Senate and the House. That's why we have to do immigration reform. As long as it's against China, it can be done. So that's my first response. We can definitely revive the Kennan spirit. To Ray Dalio, I have this to say. China will lose Cold War II if we can play a long enough game, because its demographics are a disaster. You know, it's quite possible, Peter, that the population of China could halve between now and the end of the century. It'll certainly fall by at least a third. The fertility rate is well below replacement, and that's a sign not of a healthy society, I think, but one that has a very foreshortened future. Secondly, the economy is in deep trouble. Around 29% of Chinese economic activity is real estate. The whole thing sucks because tower blocks for nobody are not a good business proposition. Thirdly, I think there's a major problem of legitimacy, which Xi Jinping understands, and that is precisely why they're striking hawkish postures in Taiwan. It's one of the few things they know they can really mobilize their population behind if growth is going down to the low single digits. The key to Cold War, as you said earlier, is that the US as a free society ought to out-innovate the totalitarian regime. So ultimately, the US is the favorite to win a technological race. If we can avoid a reckless showdown when we're not ready for prime time in the next few years, and this seems to be an argument actually for détente. Ronald Reagan made détente into a dirty word, but you know what? Détente served the United States pretty well after the debacle of Vietnam. You couldn't have been Ronald Reagan in 1970. You could only be Ronald Reagan in 1980. And what had happened in that decade? Actually, the US had done a lot to recover from the disaster of Vietnam. I think we need to take our time right now for the same reason.
Henry Kissinger bought a decade, and it was a decade we needed.
Absolutely.
Is that correct?
Absolutely. That will be the key argument that Volume 2 of my biography makes, that in that time, not only does the US kind of get over the terrible trauma of Vietnam, it's also the decade where Steve Jobs and Bill Gates invent little companies by the names of Apple and Microsoft. It's when Silicon Valley really begins. And the US starts in the 1970s to get its mojo back, even if it's not until the 80s that it politically manifests itself. And that's because détente bought time. And I strongly believe we should be buying time right now and not racing for a showdown over an island that is a long way away from the United States and very close to China.
But that which we must somehow avoid surrendering at the same time.
I think the lesson from the British experience is do try and deter your great power rival. Britain tried and failed twice to deter Germany from starting a world war. And I think the United States has to learn that lesson. It's very tempting not to pay the upfront costs of deterrence. Defense budget is projected to shrink below the interest payments on the federal debt at some point later this decade on current fiscal projections. When a superpower is spending more on debt service than defense, I think its days are numbered. You have to invest in deterrence. It's cheaper than fighting a world war. That's the lesson of British history. Americans need